actually instigated and directed, as this one seemed to have been, they will be hit back. We will hit back very hard. And the fact is that this nuclear bogey being waved around by the Pakistanis makes absolutely no sense, because even what happened in Operation Sindoor stopped a long way short of anything that approaching what would be considered a nuclear threshold. We're not here to blow up the countries or the world or whatever. We're here to just say, do not take our patience for granted. There have been far too many terrorist attacks. We have responded with superhuman restraint, and I'm afraid with Operation Sindoor we've signaled the gloves are off. Even then we did so very responsibly. I draw your attention to the fact that our strikes on the 7th of May, the night of the 6th, 7th of May, only targeted known terrorist bases and headquarters of organizations listed on the State Department's terror designate list, as well as on the UN committee's list of terrorist organizations, proscribed terrorist organizations. We very carefully did this at 1 o'clock at night, 1:05 to 1:30, to ensure the risk of civilians being around in case anything went astray was minimal, so there would be no collateral damage, and we are confident there was none. There was no collateral damage. In one particular case, we were able to see that we were able to strike the very precise building we aimed at inside a larger campus of one of these terror groups. So we believe we did this extremely correctly, and we signaled to the world and to Pakistan that we were deliberately avoiding any Pakistan government installation, any civilian facility, and even any military facility. So the message was very clear. This is not the opening salvo in what's intended to be a protracted war. This is just retribution against terrorism, and it's going to stop right there. If you stop, we stop. If you start, we reply. And that's exactly what transpired over the next 88 hours. Their actions invited retribution again. The moment their Director General of Military Operations called ours on the 10th of May and said, let's call it off, we said fine. We had never intended to prolong it. So that is the short answer. As far as as your concerns about Pakistan are concerned, we recognize that the facilities we've destroyed can be rebuilt in 6 to 9 months. And we recognize that if Pakistan has no will to dismantle the terror infrastructure, that it'll be there and primed and ready to use again. What we're hoping is that Pakistan sees that this didn't do them a whole lot of good, and that it might be, in fact, it did the army the short-term good of being able to tell their people that they're once again the saviors of their nation, which is probably one of the main motives behind this attack in the first place. But the people of Pakistan, with whom we have no quarrel, should understand that India has absolutely no interest in going to war. Our interest is in focusing on our own development and growth. But if you try and come and interrupt that story, we will give you a blow. And that's what Operation Sindoor did. So the signal is just that, resolve, nothing more.
Shashi, I just want to submit you. One of the things I think underlying your question is this belief that if we do strict actions against terrorism, it may conflagrate more. Let me tell you that there is evidence to offer otherwise. Terrorists actually are usually not very brave because they attack the civilians. And when you put some price on the terror, then they usually relent. And it takes some time. So our track record shows, since Patharkot, which is where we stopped negotiating, when we opened our doors to every person to come in and investigate, and nothing happened. And since Uri, since Balakot, and now since Sindoor, we have seen a general trend downwards in our own country. And secondly, if I take another example of terrorism, which is quasi-terrorism, which is Maoism, you see the resolve of our Home Minister, Amit Shah, and he has genuinely gone after them, and you see the number of districts which are shrinking, which are Maoist. So I think we should be bold enough to say that when the price is high, terrorism does come down. If we just stay back and say that if we attack and we do retribution, there will be counter and there's a price that they will believe, I believe that's the wrong theory. The right theory is terrorists are really Muslim. They attack civilians, and therefore if we can get them to the place where they know that there's a price to pay, over a period of time it will come down.
While we entertain no delusion that Operation Sindoor will teach Pakistan a lesson for good, because it's a habitual offender. We have seen Pakistan's Prime Minister declare, not once but multiple times, that they are on a it's their stated state policy to bleed India by 1,000 cuts. And no country in modern history has weaponized terrorism as statecraft. We definitely don't have such delusions. But it is also important to note, not just for India but for other countries, especially the United States, that India's fight against terror is not just India's fight alone. It is, we are fighting the battle on behalf of the whole world, and especially the United States in that geography. Till now, in the very recent past, five Pakistani nationals in US have orchestrated attacks in US soil. Every major terrorist attack in the last couple of decades, which involved blasts starting from 1993 WTC here in New York, to Jeddah, to San Francisco, to multiple bomb blasts in US consulates world over, more than 30 such cases have Pakistani imprint. Even now when India took the measures of Operation Sindoor and attacked the terrorist bases, we eliminated the killers of Daniel Pearl. So we are together in this fight against terror because it will impact both our nations. And when India hits, we are doing the job of the United States as well. It's very important for policymakers here to understand this.
Thank you all very much. Jonathan Panikoff from the Atlantic Council. Yesterday, Pakistan was named vice chair of the Counterterrorism Committee from the UN Security Council. I welcome your addressing that specific point, but I actually rather use it to try to ask about a broader question, which is, given that reaction by the international system, what's India's reaction, but more importantly, what faith is India nowadays putting in multilateral institutions if you have that sort of reaction?
No, I mean, I wouldn't go that far as to trash the entire institution. There is a kind of Buggins-turn system at the UN where countries take turns in presiding over such bodies, and as you know, there's half a dozen counterterrorism committees and different non-permanent members have had their chance. So as long as Pakistan's on the Security Council, this kind of quote-unquote privilege might come their way. But you must understand that these committees all work on consensus. And it's not really possible for a chairman to single-handedly get something through that the others resist, or push a particular line that other countries are not in favor of. And we are not exactly friendless on the Security Council. So we're fairly confident that that is going to be a designation without much practical consequence. But of course, we have our mission at the UN that will monitor this carefully. As you notice, our delegation did not go to the UN, and we don't see this as, for us, it's more a series of bilateral exercises with countries that we believe need to be sensitized to our point of view, and as I said, that mission has been successful. Thanks, John.
Dr. Tharoor, Delegation, great to see you all. Rick Rosso, CSIS. In this water treaty, we saw the diplomatic steps after the terror attack, and many of which we recognize, but that was obviously a step in a new and different and important direction. I know your government has petitioned a number of times through the treaty to talk about reallocation because of a lot of the changes that have happened in population and livelihoods, but what does that look like? Obviously, it's a long-term process to change the water and usage and things like that, even if the treaty's not there, but you know, there has to be some kind of process, you hope to see it initiated at some point, to see that reallocation begin. I know it's so quick after the attacks, it's tough to think about, but what does that look like to begin to repair that damage as well and see what the future looks like for this water?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, there is a bit of a challenge here in the sense that we've been trying for 2 years to get the Pakistanis to talk about the treaty. You're right about the demographic changes, but it's not just that. There's climate change. Glaciers are melting in the Himalayas. That's going to have a short-term effect of more water coming down and a long-term effect of less water. We need to face up to these realities. There's significant technological change in both dam engineering and dam management, which is simply not foreseen in the treaty. You know, the treaty reflects how much people knew and understood back in 1960, 61. Today, clearly, there's a lot of stuff that needs to be rethought through. And it can be done in a way that serves both countries' interests. And we approach the matter constructively. And for 2 years, Pakistan has obstructed any discussion on the matter. So it was very clear they had no interest in talking about this. And from our point of view, we have no interest in perpetuating an inefficient and unproductive treaty. The preamble of the treaty says it's concluded in the spirit of goodwill and friendship. Where is the goodwill and friendship coming to us from Pakistan? Instead of inflicting terrorism on us, goodwill and friendship is simply absent, right? So, I mean, we would like to see, quite frankly, Pakistan start to show some goodwill and friendship before we put the treaty back on the table. Right now, as far as we're concerned, it's an abeyance, which means that we are not going to consider the treaty to be functioning validly today, and let Pakistan understand that they need to show very clear signals to us and to the world that they are serious about dismantling the infrastructure of terrorism before we talk about anything that reflects goodwill and friendship that we're not getting from their side. Thank you.
Aman Thakur from Asia Group, and then we go to that one.
Thank you very much. Aman Thakur from the Asia Group and CSIS. I understand, Dr. Tharoor, Mr. Surya, you said that you got understanding and welcome views from all the capitals and countries that you visited.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm still curious, about any misconceptions that you still faced in your interactions, and particularly, Mr. Tripathi, I saw that in your social media posts when you were in Colombia, there was a statement that this delegation helped correct and point out that allowed for a better understanding of India's perspectives. I'm also curious in the US instance whether there was isolationist wing of the Republican Party or President Trump's tweets about the role of trade and his role of bringing trade into the conversation and bringing a ceasefire, how those misconceptions were either addressed or pointed out, and what the reaction and receptivity was to those statements by this delegation to those comments.
Right. Colombia was the only place where there had been a statement that troubled us. It was a statement issued on the 8th of May that expressed heartfelt condolences to the Pakistani victims, which kind of threw us a bit. And so when we arrived in Bogota, it so happened the way the schedule was made that the first thing we did was a press conference. So I took the opportunity to express publicly my disappointment. That night there was a welcome dinner for us, which involved a senior official dealing with such matters in the ministry, and we conveyed to her privately our real problem with this. And once the context was explained, the next morning at the meeting with the acting foreign minister, the foreign minister was away, immediately they announced the withdrawal of that statement. And they subsequently spoke to the media in Bogota, expressing full support and understanding, both for our problems on the 22nd of April, but also for our response and our right to defend ourselves against terror. One of the points we find ourselves making everywhere, because when sometimes out of a positive mindset for peace, people start talking about can't we promote some dialogue with you guys and so on. So we make it very clear to them. No one does a dialogue with a gun pointed at their heads. And from our point of view, we're always willing to talk. We have multiple languages in common with the Pakistanis. We can talk to them in any language they want. But they prefer, unfortunately, the language of force. And this is why we've had to reply in that language. I can tell you very sincerely that once we explain that there can be no equivalence between terrorists and their victims. There can be no equivalence between a state that provides safe haven to terror and a state that has repeatedly been at the receiving end of terrorist attacks. That there can be no equivalence between a state from which attacks occur and a state which is exercising its right of self-defense. Unanimously, we've had full agreement on these points. Absolutely nobody, and I do not exclude anyone on our list of meetings, has in any way demurred. In fact, they've all said we fully understand what you're saying and we fully agree with all of this. So let me say that there were no real serious misgivings. On your final point about trade, look, as far as India was concerned, we have very good sort of trade negotiations going on a completely separate track. But the officials in India, the foreign minister included, who received calls during the crisis, have all confirmed to me that trade has never been mentioned. So it's all been completely separate tracks, as it were. And on the questions about the concerns expressed about the crisis, the conflict, our responses and clarifications as to what we were doing, and our stress that if they stop, we will stop, that message was consistent throughout, and it was completely unconnected to any other topic.
In Colombia, in fact, we had a very interesting conversation with a sitting parliamentarian who is very well versed with India, is a volunteer of the Art of Living, visited even India to get married according to Hindu traditions. So when we discussed this subject about Colombia's stand and asked him, is this a result of a certain prejudice? He said, no, it is a result of ignorance. So he said, in many occasions, positions people take to service India may not always be because of prejudice, but it will also be because of ignorance. So it's incumbent on us to actually reach out and have conversations, make these engagements, to actually dispel certain notions and put our story across. Because in today's digital, social media first world, who does the story owns the story. So I think in that sense, the Prime Minister's idea of sending delegations all across the country, all across the world, to engage with multiple stakeholders is very important to put our story in perspective.
I think in that story, just one last comment on that, in that story, what surprised me personally, and I think many of us, was the enormous influence of the diaspora. Of course, we tell a story, the embassy tells a story, but I think the story that is lived in that country through the diaspora is an amazing one. And if some of you saw, we talked about it yesterday, the kind of integrity, not just in the United States, but in Ghana, in Colombia, in Panama, and Brazil also. Although Brazil, we did not meet many because we're in Brasilia, but I know that Sao Paulo and Rio have got many Indians. I think that was quite an amazing eye-opener for all of us. The presence, the impact, and the positive inspiration that our diaspora is giving to the India story is quite amazing.
Sadhu Levi from East West Center.
Yeah, a pleasure to meet you, and thank you so much for doing this session.
Sorry, who's that? Where is that?
I think they can't see you.
Oh, hi.
Sorry, hi.
Hi.
Sidhu Lubey from the East West Senate. Thanks again for doing this. Two questions. Question one, what have been, and President Trump is scheduled to go to India in November, possibly for the Quad, and that's up in the discussion. What would you like to see the United States deliver in terms of the issue that you brought forth here? Not generally U.S.-Asia policy or counterterrorism, but on this issue. And what would you like the United States to do vis-a-vis Pakistan in the next 6 months? And I must ask you, what have been, apart from the positive things the United States has done in this context, what have been some of the suboptimal things that the U.S. has done from your perspective, which you could have perhaps done better, please?
You're expecting me to be as irresponsible as India has been responsible on these matters. Now, look, let me stress, first of all, we have enormous respect for the United States, for the White House, for the State Department. We would not presume to tell them what they should do. And indeed, I think in all fairness, they don't ask us either what they should do. But we talk, the dialogue is outstanding, and it's at all levels. It's at the highest level, it's at working levels, and it's in between. And I must say that across the board, and the entire range of issues that India and the US have had the occasion to cooperate on, we have found communication channels to be absolutely superb, and the traffic has been two-way. So on the whole, what we'd like to do is see more of the same. We really would like to see this relationship expand to its fullest potential. I must say this is what we hear from others as well. Whether it's the Vice President talking about the extraordinary energy that he sees in India, that he'd like to see develop and moving forward, whether it's at the sort of diplomatic exchanges level, we are really seeing a tremendous enthusiasm and interest. What goes on between the US and a third country beyond the point is not something that I can speculate on and tell you about. I think as part of these dialogues, all these matters will be touched upon. And surely if the US wants to tell us what messages they're relaying to a troublesome friend, no doubt they will tell us. But at this point, I really have nothing to add on that. Taranjit, do you want to say anything about this? You've been privy to a lot of these conversations over the last few years. I think it might be good for you to add something.
Thank you. I think since these are very, very informed friends, so one doesn't need to go over some of the basics which all of you know very well. But there's 3 points I want to leave. Since you represent a lot of thinking that's done in the United States, Firstly, as our leader mentioned, the action was very clear, focused on terrorists. And these terrorists are no friends of the United States. I don't need to explain more. In the past, you have seen. This can also hit in the future. So, there needs to be a much deeper understanding of what's going on in that area. Secondly, whenever, and I know there are experts sitting here, whenever the Pakistan army has faced a challenge,